You found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something.
Welcome to Ways We Learn. My name is Joe, and I am joined today with my other co-hosts, Sean and Brian. Today, our guest is James Genone, who leads innovation at Minerva Project. He's in charge of product strategy for Minerva's academic partnerships. He joined in 2015 to help build Minerva University, overseeing general education and curriculum development. Formerly, he was a philosophy professor, teaching and conducting research in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Now, in addition to his role at Minerva, he's also been going deeper and deeper into AI as it applies to education. And I actually didn't put it together, but I realized with your philosophy background, I bet you're using some of that in thinking through AI, right?
You bet.
There we go. Well, welcome, James. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into the more heavy-hitting questions, how did you get into education in general?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, it's funny, given the way my career in education went, my first kind of entry into education was actually through outdoor education. So I was
Cool.
a summer camp counselor when I was in high school and loved doing that.
Were you like
Taking
Knowles
younger kids.
kind of deal?
No, super, kind of local thing down where I grew up on the coast of California. And then in undergrad, I actually became a kind of rock climbing and mountaineering guide and taught a lot of classes up in the Sierra and so on, and loved the sort of teaching part of that. It always attracted me. And at the same time, in college, while I was taking a lot of philosophy classes and so on, I looked up to a lot of the professors I had and thought that way of life, getting to kind of study and research things you were passionate about, topics you were passionate about, looked like a pretty interesting life. So, those two things came together, and I actually had this like big choice point in my life, like whether I was going to become a climbing guide professionally or go to grad school. And I ended up choosing grad school, which I think was probably a good choice for me, but still managed to spend a lot of time in the outdoors and love still teaching people how to do those things I'm passionate about.
That's awesome. So then you had a career in academia, and then you made a switch over to Minerva back, I think you said 2015, right? So they were still
exactly.
pretty early.
Very early. What happened for me was that, I kind of, after a difficult time in the job market around the financial crisis in 2008, when a lot of academic jobs disappeared, I had this great postdoc at Stanford, which I was lucky to be in during that time. And then finally sort of landed the tenure track job a few years later at Rutgers. And it was kind of the holy grail, right? The tenure track faculty position at a research university. And when I got there, I just found that my incentives weren't perfectly aligned with that job. I had a successful research program and I enjoyed it, but I was really much more passionate about teaching. I had gotten exposed to kind of student-centered learning when I was at Stanford and had increasingly invested in that. And I was lucky that I got a lot of kind of grant support for doing innovative teaching at Rutgers. But, most of my colleagues, and the way that the university and Rutgers as an alumnus was set up, was to prioritize research. And I just really wanted to focus more on making an impact through teaching. So I was lucky enough to find out about Minerva, which was at the time, the company was building this brand new university, which was focused on taking learning science and putting it into practice in a really systematic way in this new institution. And I joined partway through the first kind of pilot year when there were around 35 students or so, and then got to be involved in kind of that whole building effort over the next several years, which was a really cool opportunity.
That's great. And then just so people know, what is Minerva? I know there's project and university. Can you give us the quickie on what the two do?
Yeah, so the vision for the company was really to try to bring a lot of much needed reform into higher education through teaching and learning in particular, and through teaching the kinds of durable interdisciplinary skills that students really need to be successful in their lives and their employment that they don't get in the traditional university experience. And to do it using all these results from learning science that we've found out about in the last 20, 30 years, but that have never been systematically implemented in education. And so the thought was, it'd be hard to just kind of go into existing academic institutions and get people to implement that. So what we needed first was a proof of concept. And so there was this idea to start this new university based on this. And it ended up having a bunch of other interesting elements. So the students travel to 7 different cities globally while they're doing their degree. They live together in cohorts and they do experiential learning in the cities, and they take their classes online in this learning platform that we built for active learning. So the faculty are all over the world. So it's a really unusual design. And I think, we were able to accomplish what we set out to do, which was to prove that you could create an accredited, nonprofit, actually much less expensive undergraduate university experience that was extremely high quality and that produced really good outcomes for students. Graduates from Minerva University do incredibly well getting into graduate school and getting great jobs. And the population is incredibly diverse socioeconomically. They come from like over 60 or 70 different countries globally. So the university has been awesome. It's totally separate now from the company that started it. It's independent governance. Like I said, it's accredited and nonprofit. And the company owns a lot of the IP that we created through founding the university. So we've used that to create a business where we work with universities now all over the world to help them build innovative, interdisciplinary new programs, both online and in person.
Very cool. Yeah, I've heard of it. I mean, I feel like I've circled Minerva for a long time. So it was nice to finally, when we first got to meet someone who was kind of behind all that cool stuff. When did you, I guess, almost a similar question on the kind of generative AI side. When did you first discover it? What was your introduction to it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go way back and say that I've been interested in AI for a really long time. As part of my research career, I kind of studied cognition and like how cognition works and what it is and consciousness and perception, all these different aspects of the mind. And one of the leading theories of how human minds work is called the computational theory of mind. And it basically says human minds are like computers. And so that immediately gets you to thinking about, okay, well, if that's true, couldn't we just like build one, right? It would be an artificial intelligence. There's lots of debates around that in the philosophical literature going back quite a ways. So I used to teach that material in my courses and thought a lot about it, thought a lot about potential applications in education, was always interested in like sci-fi that covered this topic. So we could go down that rabbit hole if you want.
What's
to.
any favorite
True.
Any favorite sci-fi books that have like generative AI or AI cognition in it?
The one that I end up talking the most about these days is called The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, which imagines it imagines a kind of AI tutor for young kids that really kind of riffs on like the Bloom 2 Sigma tutoring concept that like you can just get like way more powerful learning in this kind of one-to-one, highly individualized educational approach. So yeah, I feel like we're so much closer to that than I ever thought we would be in my lifetime. But to answer your question directly, I had followed the development of GPT-3 and had gotten to use it a little bit and thought, wow, this is really cool. It's, very different than the traditional kind of chatbot model where you have a bunch of pre-canned responses and it kind of picks the best one to give based on the inputs. So it's, pretty consistent and pretty reliable in terms of what it outputs, but it's also not creative at all in any way. And when I saw GPT-3, I was like, oh, okay, this is really different than that paradigm, but the quality of the output is not very high. Like, I would have compared it to like a C student at best, like in a good answer. And then I was at a conference in August, really unusual, very interesting conference where there were a bunch of people from the AI community, including some who are working for one of the bigger generative AI companies. And I got access to an early version of one of the more powerful models. And it was much better than GPT-3. It was, probably at the level of like ChatGPT, maybe even a little bit better. And I was blown away. I just thought, wow, the advance over what GPT-3 was doing was very significant in a short period of time, right? And if it keeps advancing like at this rate, and in fact, it seems like the rate of advance is even faster now that there's all these resources and people working on it, this is going to have significant impacts in the near term. So I started thinking about that. I started working on a paper that's about the implications of this for education. I managed to create a partnership with one of these AI companies for Minerva to do some experiments kind of behind the scenes on how we could use the technology for curriculum development and assessment, things like that. And so I learned a lot, got to talk to a lot of people about it. And then, of course, in December, ChatGPT dropped. Suddenly, everybody was talking about it, and it became even more important, sort of part of my day-to-day job as I work with folks at universities.
You said you're writing. Oh, what's your white paper on again? Sorry.
It's really about how higher ed institutions can create a kind of AI strategy, right? There's a lot of individual faculty members using it. Students are using it a ton. Leaders are confused, unsure what to do, wondering if they should ban it, things like that. So try to pull together some recommendations for how they can build capacity and think about policy and just also think about how they devote resources to creating a sort of coherent AI strategy for their institutions.
Can you give us a little bit of a preview of that? What's the general thesis or thrust of that?
Yeah, the first thing when you have this conversation with most folks is you have to kind of cut through the concerns about cheating and academic integrity. And I know you guys did a whole podcast episode on this, which I listened to, which is great. The perspective we're putting forward is that policing and banning generative AI is hopeless. The adoption is already way too high. There's too many ways to use it to possibly ban it or really police it. We know that the tools that claim to recognize whether text is AI generated don't work. They're not reliable. And so that's a bit of a fool's errand. And the right thing to do instead is to kind of adapt and evolve the way you do teaching and learning to accommodate not just that students are going to use these, but they're actually going to need to use them for their jobs. So when they go out into the economy, when they graduate, they're going to be expected to have proficiency in working with AI. So you might as well get them doing that when they're in college and getting a degree.
Right.
So then we have a couple of very concrete recommendations for how to do that around, like I said before, building capacity, changing sort of curriculum and assessment to both integrate and take into account AI so that people aren't just using it mindlessly, but actually using it in intentional, useful ways. And then also thinking a little bit about the technologies themselves and how they can be used to like run a university and do some of the teaching and learning tasks more effectively and consistently and efficiently.
I figured that was true, but it's good to hear that, not good to hear, I guess. I don't know. It's interesting to hear that all the like cheat detection things actually suck. Actually, they can't figure it out.
There are examples of false positives coming out that people are getting punished for cheating when
brutal.
they actually had nothing to do with that. And
that stinks. Yeah, that stinks.
It's good that it's happening now, right? People are figuring it out, I think.
If they figure it out and don't just keep relying on them. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. How are you, I guess, like, what's the relationship between the white paper and the research you're doing with kind of real world applications? Like, have you been playing with stuff for the past 6 months and this is kind of a survey of the stuff you've tried and what worked and what didn't? Like, how do you know what you're proposing works? Or why do you believe that, right?
Well, one of the challenges right now is that tools that are custom built for teaching and learning contexts are not really out there in the wild yet. Yeah. The most sophisticated thing that's available, which is not primarily for a higher ed audience, is Khan Academy's Khanmigo. And I could spend a lot more time talking about that. I think it's kind of standard setting for what applications of the technology can really look like. But there aren't too many other great things that are currently kind of integrated with the kinds of technology tools that people use in higher ed, like learning management systems, for example. Yeah. And so that means that faculty members and students are, more or less like using ChatGPT off the shelf, right? And, that's just a chatbot, and it has real limitations because you have to know what you're doing to use it. You have to, prompt it in effective ways. Yeah. And my own personal view is that the chatbot style of interface is not going to be the winner in terms of how we use the technology. I think really when we have tools that prompt us, and this is what Khanmigo is good at, that kind of help guide us through a process of thinking something through or creating something or improving something, and then, kind of acts as a co-pilot or thought partner in how we do that, that's when it really kind of shines. And because we don't have those tools yet that are specifically built for education, we're going to be in this kind of chaotic period where people are finding and hacking their own ways of doing this. And seeing kind of what sticks. And then, companies, I'm sure, will learn from that and start building things that are more effective and so on. So I think the biggest thing universities can do right now is just like build their awareness, their knowledge, their capability, train their faculty, come up with good policies, encourage students to use it in good ways and helpful ways that will prepare them well. And then, the technology will kind of catch up with what the needs are and hopefully serve them.
I will say that I've been learning Python with ChatGPT and have found it to be exceedingly helpful.
Asking it questions and it's like giving you answers and that kind of stuff.
Explain this line of code to me. Explain what this does. Like, show me examples. Break this down as if I was 12. The thing that I'm actually most interested in these days is the thing that James kind of touched on, is it actually probing me. Yeah. So one of the things, like I think one of the first 5 or 6 things I did when I actually got into ChatGPT was asked it to pretend it was Socrates and question me on my values. that got a little too deep for me. But I've enjoyed that process of having the interface. So like every time I plugged in a piece of code to have it explained to me, I also have it quiz me later. So I say, pull from all the code snippets that we have and derive an exercise for me that you think I might not be able to solve. And it's actually reasonably good at that. And I've been playing around with these like tree of thought chains that exist now. And you can actually have like multiple people holding on to like specific thoughts and then pushing you.
What's a tree of thought chain?
So like it basically creates like a random forest of options for it to choose from. So like usually it just goes like input, output. But if using tree of thought, it can go input, output, and then go back up the tree. So like it can hold specific thoughts together. Like one of the problems that these models have is like, if Bob, like you give it the thing, like Bob is in the kitchen, he has the cup, he has a ball in the cup. He goes into the bedroom and turns the cup upside down. Then he goes into the garden and puts the cup on the table. Where's the ball? Most of the time the LLM thinks it's in the garden because it doesn't recognize it turning the cup over. We'll do this.
Empty the ball.
But with tree of thoughts, you can actually say, set up to like debate yourself on where the ball is at and create multiple experts to come back at you. And it will actually figure out that the ball, because the experts question, wait, did the ball actually leave the bedroom? And the LLM will question itself. And then it will start to realize that the ball didn't. But you need to be able to create these like prompts that allow it to hold things in memory and question those memories essentially.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's really cool stuff.
Effectively, it's the same thing you'd want to do for a student.
Yeah. So Brian's pulling out a bunch of things that they did in Conmigo that I think are really effective and part of what makes it so great. So one thing they did is they gave the tutor context. So it's meant to be like a helpful tutor. And the way you enter into it for the most part is like you're in a Khan Academy lesson, like there's a video of Sal Khan explaining, whatever exponents to you or something like that. And because it's a video, there's a transcript, and that means the transcript can be context for the language model. So when you're asking it questions about exponents, right, it can refer to the content of the video in giving you its answers rather than just using the kind of generic answer set that it has, which I think helps it with math to do better at answering those kinds of questions. And then secondly, in part, I think they did this, my understanding is to like make it safer for kids, is they actually have like one version of the model, like checking the answers that the base model is giving to make sure that they don't violate certain principles or that they're helpful in the right ways. And they've tuned it up so that like, if you try to get it to just like give you the answer, right, for like cheating purposes and that sort of thing, like it won't do that. It will instead help you to like break the problem down and to try to work through the different aspects of it and so on. And there are a bunch of different results that show that when you do what Brian was just describing, get the model to kind of like break problems down, it can be really good at kind of explaining each individual step and how they work and getting to like much better results. And so it can help us do that as well.
Gosh, that must be so frustrating. Just give me the answer.
The models, these things they get really weird. A question for you. So, your background is in student-centered learning, also philosophy. You now have these AI models that could theoretically give everybody an AI tutor. What are and you're also thinking about like, how can the models themselves probe the student, right? How are you mixing these things together? Like where's the project that like blends these things together using AI, student-centered learning, and almost, I don't want to say adversarial AI, but that's sort of what it feels like sometimes when it's probing.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a great question.
Is there something in there that you're going after?
I would love to. I don't think that project like fully exists yet, right? People are still at the very early stages trying to figure out where this fits into different components of education. And there's so many obvious places, right? I mean, one challenge that I think about a lot is just like teachers, particularly in K-12, but also in higher education, given the way the incentive structure works, are like incredibly overburdened, right? And there's these parts of education that are extremely labor intensive. So one of them is generating curriculum themselves, like just figuring out what you're going to teach in class, whether you're building an asynchronous online course or teaching live in person, in a physical classroom. It takes a lot of time, and it's hard to do it with like quality and consistency. When I used to teach logic, I would have to come up with like lots and lots of logic problems for my students to solve. And I would like often like come up with bad problems. Like it was just a challenge I faced. They were like hard. My students would point out the mistakes I made and that sort of thing. So that's one place where AI can help, is just help you like do a lot of that like shovel work. Second area is assessment, like grading students, but especially like giving them high quality formative feedback like on a regular basis that they can learn from, which is one of the key kind of insights from learning science about how students can improve, is incredibly labor intensive. And it's the thing that like nobody carves out time for in a teacher's workload. So it's another area where like I think AI can really help. And this is like all kind of the low hanging fruit, like ways it'll make teachers more efficient. But then what it can allow them to do that's much more exciting is think about what I think you were getting at, Brian, which is like, how do we actually, now that we have this extra time, hopefully rather than just devoting it to our research, think about the individual students that we have. What are the challenges they're facing? How can we unlock some of those challenges for them? How can we use the technology in a tutor mode to help them break through their individual barriers they're facing, make their experience much more personalized and adaptive? That's what like a lot of the early promise that people thought AI would have is in kind of an adaptive learning. But you have to see adaptive learning in the context of an overall educational experience, which is social, which is bounded by other pressures, that students have. Most, 70% of students in the United States work while they're in school. We forget that, those of us who went to a 4-year college where we were full-time college students, but that's not the norm in US higher education. So thinking about all these different components and how AI can, throughout this system, really help us to alleviate some of the pain points, I think is going to be the work that we have in front of us for the next couple of years, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Has Minerva, I'm curious, has Minerva put together like a relatively large data set that you can pull from to like fine tune the model? So like, you talked about this formative feedback tool, and I actually built one for writing to kind of get a sense of how it works. Are you able to pull like formative feedback that teachers have given to train the model, or is this mostly prompt engineering?
Yeah, I think it's both. Minerva has an incredible data set because the university, at least, all the courses have been taught online. They're all recorded. You could generate a transcript of every class. We've not done that. But we also, every single piece of feedback that a student gets is tied to a particular learning objective. So it has that as metadata. And they're all graded in exactly the same way, which is using a rubric, a 5-point rubric. So it's an incredibly rich data set using, these sort of learning science principles. We've done some pretty interesting research on it. The biggest challenge we have is we don't have a control condition of any kind. So we can't really compare like what we're doing to what other people are doing. So they're so different. But we thought a lot about how you could train a model using the data set, particularly on the assessment piece, but also the curriculum is also highly structured. So we can use that to train it to develop new curricula or better curricula and so on. So that's a really interesting opportunity that I hope we will take advantage of.
That's an amazing asset you're sitting on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then I guess what is Minerva, or how is Minerva thinking of incorporating AI into their education?
Yeah, it's a great question, which we are approaching, I think, in a very careful, cautious, intentional way, appropriately so. As with any actually operating university, like the biggest concern is like kind of engaging with students where they're at on this. And so there has been a lot of that's happened in the past, several months, really developing a lot of policy. There's a number of faculty who have experimented with ways in which they can integrate AI into their classes, get students using it, giving them feedback on that, and encouraging them, as I suggested earlier, to use it in really thoughtful, like intentional ways rather than mindless ways. And I'm currently running a project on my team, which is not in the university, but we will, I think, collaborate with the university on this to really try to answer the question, to create some prototypes of like, what does an AI integrated class look like? Which really we're talking end to end. So we're like, how can we use the tools in the creation of the curriculum? How can we basically give students opportunity to use the tools when they're doing their homework and kind of preparing for class, during class, and then post class? How do they help us with assessment, and how can they even help us evaluate how a class went, right? Did we actually hit the learning outcomes we wanted to? Did the conversation go well, or were we off track, and why? What were the pain points? The things it can do with summarization, things like that, are great. So we're kind of working out all those different steps. I think one of the things we're doing as we evaluate that is asking, which of these things are things we can do right now without building anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just using tools such as they are already available, which require us to build new features into our own platform, or think about using other tools that we haven't incorporated yet. And then where do we think we're going to get the most leverage from? Because there's way too much that we could do here to do it all at once. So we want to at least have a hypothesis that we can test about what we think will make the biggest difference and improve the quality of learning the quickest.
So I'm curious about two things. One is specific to Minerva, which is, so you have an educator who comes and works at Minerva University, I think probably understands that there's I guess it's not a parent corporation, but an associated corporation, right, that they may end up working with. And so going into a classroom and saying, we're going to set up an experiment like you just described to see how AI fits in is sort of the deal, right? If you're going to be an educator at Minerva University, that kind of thing could happen. I'm curious about the faculty's reaction to that and how educators feel about going along with that. And then to extend that outside, say you find that this really works. What is your expectation for a professor's feelings about doing the same thing at, say, Harvard or some university that's not associated with Minerva where they don't have to do this? How is this going to be received?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing to say is that, Minerva University is totally autonomous. They're not obligated to do anything with us. Right. And the great thing is there's, I would say most, if not all, the faculty there, and certainly the leadership there are really interested in doing anything that might improve student learning. So, nobody's going to have to be voluntold, right? There are going to be a lot of volunteers, I think, for this kind of work. And the university, independently of the work that we're doing on my team, has had a number of faculty who have explored this kind of on their own. And they're also they have a working group. Many universities right now, the current state of play is that they've formed some kind of committee or working group to really explore, the application of technologies and develop policy and so on. So Minerva University has that as well. And yeah, I think we're really excited to potentially collaborate with them and our other partners. And we consider them kind of one of our partners, the most important specialist partner. And we have faculty at other universities who are very interested in understanding more about this and how they can use it. And, the way it works when we want to try something new or run an experiment is, we propose it to a partner. And if they agree and they're on board, then, we really collaborate on it. And that's how it's worked with anything new that we've come up with over the last few years since we've been doing this work.
That's great.
What is the relationship between the faculty who are teaching in a classroom and the sort of academic organization? And I think actually what I'm most curious about is what's the feedback mechanism? So if a teacher gets a piece of curriculum and they're like, hey, this is not working or this is off in some way, how does that cycle back through?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I can see, actually, I hadn't thought of this before, but some of the parallels to the way I think bootcamp education can work. So, when Minerva University got started, we built this general education curriculum where every student takes the same 8 courses during their freshman year, which introduces them to these kind of foundational interdisciplinary skills that we think everyone should learn. So I actually remember hearing you guys say on one of the podcasts, you think everyone should learn statistics. Well, at Minerva, everyone learns statistics. Everyone learns to code in Python a little bit. Everyone learns critical thinking, effective communication, design thinking, systems thinking, lots of stuff over the course of the year. And one of the cool things about that is it introduces them to all the disciplines they could major in, right? So they touch everything. They touch political science, psychology, computer science, business, and so on. So they can make a really informed decision about what they want to major in because they've literally been required to spend at least a few weeks on all those subjects. And then they go on and they start entering into their majors and taking elective courses from other majors and so on. And all those courses were built outside the gen ed by subject matter experts, by faculty who we hired as teachers in the university. And whoever, and there's a limited course catalog. I think there's something like 70 or 80 courses at Minerva total. Maybe there's a few more than that now. But all the courses are kind of team taught, right? So you have a group of faculty who's teaching it in a given semester when it's offered. And they have a lot of agency. So even though they may not be the person who created the initial version of the course, because maybe that person's teaching something else now or not at the university anymore, whoever's teaching the current instance gets to look back at the evaluations and the feedback, both from the instructors and from students on the previous version of the course. They can look at the learning outcomes because we have all this data and see how did the students do, which units were the hardest for them. And they can make decisions about improving the course kind of as they're implementing it. And there's always someone who's kind of in charge in collecting a new set of data for the next iteration of the course to kind of inform that. And, every couple of years or something, usually, especially if course seems like it could really use it, they'll make the decision to actually redo, invest in over the summer or something, heavily revising the course. So even though it is a centralized curriculum and you don't just get to show up in class and teach wherever you feel like, there is a lot of faculty agency in the process. And because we teach in teams, it's highly collaborative, which is not something you get at most universities. People really enjoy that. I think it's one of the nicest parts about working at Minerva. And it avoids this problem that you have in other universities where if you took the kind of intro class in psychology or chemistry or whatever depending on what professor you had, you might have had a totally different syllabus. I mean, there's probably some overlap, right? You get some of the same core concepts, but when you teach the more advanced class, you find out that like depending on which professor they had, your students may come in with like very different, areas that they're good at or not good at or prepared for. And that makes it really hard to teach the classes that have prerequisites.
Mm.
And so Minerva kind of eliminated that problem by standardizing around learning outcomes. And even though, again, we have this kind of faculty agency in there, they're all committed to making sure that the students have a kind of equitable, uniform experience in terms of what they learn so that they're ready for more advanced subject matter. It's a good way to run a university, I think.
That's great. I want to bring us a little bit back to AI. I'm kind of curious, an educator, I mean, you can choose one, you can choose professor, K-12 teacher, whatever you want. Haven't used ChatGPT, like, where should they get started on just like trying to do something to move the ball forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think everyone has to spend some time just personally using an LLM and getting past the like asking the questions you would ask to Google in it, because those, you don't usually get great results when you ask those questions. It's when you give it more information, more context, tell it why, tell it what a good answer looks like, all these kinds of things that go into what we call prompt engineering, that it gets a lot more interesting. And I think teachers can immediately get into this mindset when you start actually treating it more like it was like really an assistant, right?
Yeah.
So if you had a real human assistant, you would give the human a bunch of context before you ask them to do something for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so just treat the model that way, right? Tell it all the context you would give to a human assistant, and then ask it to do the thing. And it'll probably do a lot better than if you just ask it to do the thing without the context. And that's the way you start experimenting with that. Spend a couple hours doing that, and it gets pretty interesting pretty quickly.
It seriously does. I mean, I think that's one of the secrets of ChatGPT is that there is a secret interface, right? Because there's all these like things you could do and advanced ways to use it, and prompt engineering, and blah, 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 and like 8,000 LinkedIn posts on 10 prompts that'll change your world. But ultimately, you can kind of it is cool within 1 or 2 questions asked.
Yeah.
Like speed from knowing nothing to being like, oh, that's really freaking cool is, I think, the fastest of any product I've ever used.
Yeah. There's a good joke that there's nothing faster in the universe than a person becoming an expert in generative AI.
I mean, it's certainly easy.
I think I'm that guy. I'm that guy.
It's certainly easy when there's so much resources online right now, and it's only been on kind of generally available for 2 years.
Mm.
So like, if you have 6 months of experience, you're in the top, quartile or 10% of everyone. It's like back in the days when I used to be an iOS instructor and developer, there was always the joke of like, everyone would say they were an expert in some new technology in iOS because iPhone had just come out 2 years ago. Right. Like all these things like, oh, we need a person with 5 years of iOS experience. It's like, well, it only existed for 2 years.
Well, there's also something there just about the return on investment of using ChatGPT versus other software, right? Like there's not a lot of software where with, as you said, 1 or 2 prompts, you can generate really valuable information without actually knowing how to use the software. And that's kind of a staggering return on investment for someone who's never really done much in the way of programming or computing, or just doesn't feel that they're technologically fluent, to be able to go into this website like ChatGPT, type in a question, and get not just an answer, but a really coherent answer. And within 1 or 2 shots, that's amazing results.
Yeah, I think
don't know that that's existed in anything else.
One of my favorite people who's thinking about generative AI in higher education is this professor at Penn, Ethan Mollick, who has this blog called One Useful Thing. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it highly. And it gets into fairly deep water for, I think, maybe the average teacher, but for enthusiasts, it's really great. And he's done some incredible things himself where like, he was like, okay, part of what he does, one of his jobs at Penn is he like helps them create case studies and simulations. I think he's a business professor for kind of, they license these case studies, I guess. And so he was like, okay, if I wanted to like just build something like this from scratch, like a whole new business around this, like, could I do that in half an hour? And I guess he doesn't know how to code or something. So he just basically got like I don't remember if he used ChatGPT or Bing or what he used exactly. I think he used a couple different tools. But in half an hour, he got it to like talk him through like building the website. He's like, okay, it wrote the code for him, but then he's like, okay, what do I do with the code? Like, where do I put it? And it told him like how to do that. And
Saw
he
this,
got
yeah.
design, stuff from Midjourney, and it's like, and he has a lot of blog posts that are like this, where he's like shows you how powerful this stuff is in like 10 minutes. You can do stuff. It's one thing to like do something you already know how to do really efficiently. It's another thing to do something you don't know how to do really efficiently. That's crazy. Like the game changer.
It's exceedingly good at like increasing the zone of proximal development.
For
right?
Sure.
Everywhere, like in every direction. The thing that I've found challenging to do, like thinking about it like as an AI tutor, right? Which is I think a popular app that people are trying to build now. I find it difficult to get it to do some of the things that I would really want a great tutor to do. So like I was thinking back, like I've been, learning Python with it, and I learned JavaScript from a one-on-one tutor. His name was Rob Cobb. The great and wonderful.
I know Rob.
He's great. Rob was one of the most amazing teachers I've ever worked with. And, one of the things that he did really well was not tell me the answer, but sort of question me into finding the answer. And I found that it's very hard for ChatGPT to do that because I don't think it has a real sense of where I'm at any point. It doesn't have a sense of my knowledge. And solving that problem would be amazing. But that does feel to me to be like a gap in the AI tutor. Like it can tell me what to do, but it can't guide me there. It doesn't seem like, or at least I haven't been able to prompt engineer it to guide me there with the right question.
It's hard because if you want to take a student down the journey of questions to then get them there, you have to have kind of the end in mind. And then you kind of work backwards into like 5 or 6 questions inevitably. And I imagine then it's very hard for ChatGPT to figure out, wait, what's the end thing I want them to think through? And then like do all the little questional leaps from there to there.
Joe, thank you for saying that, because I was trying to grasp for that. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, you're like in theory, if you are doing this credit method correctly, you probably have the end in mind.
Right.
The last question you want to ask, and you have a bunch of questions you have to do to get them there.
For sure. This is where I think ChatGPT is not a tutor, and where the Conmigo execution, like taking us back to that, is just like so much better, because it is working from this context of like, here's the lesson on JavaScript or whatever, and this is what you're trying to learn, and so these are the right questions to ask you, and based on how you answer those questions, it's finding out what you know, right? And then it can improve the prompts that it gives you to like help walk you through the next step and so on. So it's doing a kind of implicit assessment of your knowledge based on how you respond to those prompts. And I think we're going to make this like a lot more sophisticated. I mean, the thing I'm hoping we'll all get to work on soon is a system that's taking in all of the work that you've done, not just in this one chat session with the tutor, but actually over a prolonged period of time in a course,
of course.
Assessments that have been graded and so on. And it has a running mental model, of Brian and where he's at with his learning, and it knows what you're working on right now. And it can help use all of that to kind of guide you, and not even just like how you're doing on this particular skill, but what you're actually good at and not good at more generally, and like what unlocks have worked for you in the past and which ones haven't. So you can imagine like very, very sophisticated. This is what a human tutor knows about someone who they've been tutoring for a long time. I used to tutor when I was in college. Like you get to know your students, and like, okay, this student, like they need analogies, right? That's what works for them, right? Or this student, they need lots of examples, and so I think we will be able to build versions of this technology that are like that, but we're not there yet. We got a ways to go.
Yeah, it being able to hold in its attention the mental model of what you know is it's like what's missing. Like that's exactly what I'm looking for.
Well, I think the models themselves, they have to be embedded, I think, in interfaces that are containing different pieces of data that the model can draw on at the right time. So I think a lot of people are very focused on building AI first tools that can solve every problem just with kind of a fine-tuned model. But I think we have to think more in terms of traditional software in some ways, and then AI superpowering that. So when we thought about the learning management system we built, we were looking to like aggregate different kinds of data about how students were engaging and their learning outcomes and so on into dashboards that humans could use to kind of help those individual students. And we use a lot of different approaches to doing that. And so now we're talking about adding this other element of generative AI into that. And we have to give it the right information about the student at the right time to help it interact with the student in the right way. And that's a little bit more complex than just fine tuning the model.
Yeah, because it's also about, I mean, it's not just it's to go back to Brian's point, it's figuring out what is the data representation of this student's current mental model. Like, what the heck is that? Let alone how do we feed it and all that stuff. It turns out, I think, how do we feed it actually is probably a little bit easy. It's what the heck is the data representation of a student's mental model of their understanding.
But that's being done to some extent already. That there's software out there. I mean, my daughter uses IXL. That's one of the ones that does it. There's MobiMath. There's tons of things that are already trying to map the mental model of the student in order to do differentiated learning.
That's cool. Didn't know
And
that.
it seems like maybe it's
And
just
they
that
do it
there's
via
not.
assessments?
Yeah. So they do the more assessment you
cool.
do, the more accurate that mapping
Right.
becomes and the more targeted the learning becomes, so that
That's cool.
the system can say, this is the next thing you should learn. And then you go back and do the assessment in a week. And if you've learned it, then cool, you're on to this other thing. And they sort of have built the flow of what you need to learn based on the way that the curriculum is designed and what the outcomes are and all of that. It feels to me like the missing piece is not the ability to do that so much as the connection between the AI and that mapping, because I think that mapping is being done to some extent, but those tools are not real AI. And the AI, like ChatGPT, does not have the capacity that those tools have. But if those two were put together, it feels like we could have a real tutor, no?
Yeah.
Well, I
The
think,
gaps.
my kids use some of these adaptive learning software as well, like Dreambox, for example, for math,
Exactly. That's
and
another,
that
yeah.
that do like what you're describing. And I think those tools work really well when it comes to like content, like level of difficulty, or like which kinds of problems are they struggling with,
Hmm.
or which parts of the problem, that sort of thing. There's also pedagogy, and I referred to this kind of implicitly in a previous thing I said, which is that students there's the research on learning styles has kind of been debunked, but it is true that
Thoroughly.
that students, that there are particular kind of approaches, pedagogical approaches that work better for some students than others. And, a simple version of this is like some students are extremely extroverted and will talk a lot, right? And you get
Yeah.
them talking and you'll find out quickly like what they know and what they don't know. And others, you really have to draw it out of them, right? And so things like that. And I think we don't, these adaptive tools don't have any of that kind of stuff in the model. And I think they don't look at like patterns of success and failure across different domains of knowledge, right? That's
Mhm.
not a thing that any model I'm aware of, any tool I'm aware of does. That sort of thing I think is very powerful when you start thinking about accelerating learning, and especially when you look at students who are really struggling in the educational system. This is where I get the most excited. One of the first really coolest applications of generative AI I heard about was the concept of enabling a large language model in WhatsApp on a dumb phone for refugee camps in Jordan, where they don't have any teachers and they have like a limited number of textbooks.
Yeah.
If you just think about that for a second, that's really powerful. And now if
Wow.
you sophisticate that up to like, the US, where we have some schools that are very underserved, and how can we supplement the teacher shortage, things like that,
Hmm.
that can be super impactful. But it'll be that much more impactful if we bring together, the content and the pedagogy.
One of the things that I've been thinking about with, because I've done a lot of time just thinking about ed tech in general, and AI strikes me, or generative AI strikes me as the first time we've actually seen something that really could shift the way that we interact, just dramatically shift the way that we interact with the creation of knowledge. And I'm curious whether you see this as sort of the ed tech that we've been waiting for, the chosen one, so to speak, or is this just going to be another thing that makes education maybe a little bit better if it's used well, and cool, on to the next thing in 20 years?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if I'm honest, I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone does. I think there's two sort of tentative hypotheses I have. One is that edtech's actually going to be pretty slow on this technology, and that industry is going to lead. And a lot of the applications that are being used in industry and businesses will get adopted by students and teachers
Mhm.
way ahead of like the equivalent product being available built for education. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of chaos, actually, because I think it's going to be really tough for teachers, especially. They're going to have students coming into class being like, "Hey, look, I found this thing and it solves like all the assignments for this entire class in some way you didn't anticipate."
Mhm.
Um,
Brutal.
or your colleagues are going to be using tools that make your research irrelevant or something like that. So, and the economic incentives in industry are just totally different than they are in education to kind of drive that sort of adoption. So, I think it will be hard for education oriented companies to kind of keep up because they have a lot of masters they're serving, right?
Mhm.
The second thing that I think is interesting in this area is that a lot of ed tech is very well intentioned to try to help students who are struggling the most and then ends up actually getting adopted by students who need it the least. MOOCs, just to give a dumb example, were supposed to be the great equalizer. And then it turns out most of the people who took them already had degrees. So, I worry about that in this area. I was at a workshop on Tuesday where equity was a really big focus. And I hope that folks will think a lot about how these tools can be used to help underprepared, underserved students, because I think the applications that serve them will actually serve everyone.
Mhm.
But if you build for the students who are sort of most privileged, doing the best in education, those applications will probably not be as useful for people who are struggling.
Yeah. You mentioned, and I want to go back to this. You mentioned teachers just sort of trying to keep up, or there's this new technology coming in that potentially makes research irrelevant. Something that I've been just thinking about is again, this is the first time that technology has come into the picture that could potentially make teachers irrelevant. And it's not happening at this point, right? But down the road, I mean, if you look at the way that ChatGPT has evolved, or GPT 3 to 4 has evolved and gone so quickly from being sort of a novelty to like passing the bar exam, this thing is growing really fast, getting better really fast. And in 5 years, 10 years, what are we going to be looking at? And I guess, what's your thought on just, should educators be afraid? Should educators be thinking, this is going to eat my lunch? I should get out now, get my retirement package, and let the computers take over the world.
Yeah, I kind of think the opposite, actually. I think, now or maybe soon is going to be like a really good time to get into education because education has traditionally been terrible, right? It's poorly compensated, highly stressful.
Yeah,
If you're in K-12, especially in the public school system, like you're spending a lot of time doing behavior management as much as you are doing education,
sure.
so on. And we already mentioned like all of these super labor intensive things that teachers are expected to do. And I think these tools have the potential to really help them. I think humans are always going to be a critical part of education, especially the younger the students are, right? It's as much a social growth and learning experience as it is an intellectual one. And we need humans for that. We need humans to be the mentors and the guides and to help students learn to collaborate, socialize with their peers, and all those sorts of things. In K-12 education, subject matter expertise matters less because you're teaching students more foundational material. You know, I think that can be even more true in a world where you have AI providing content and so
Mhm,
on. So teachers can really be the master facilitators. They can be the ones who really understand their students on a sort of human level
mhm,
and, offload the thing that they don't know about history. Like even the best history professor doesn't know everything about all of history to the machines and so on.
mhm,
So it has the potential to be very powerful in that way and make us all better teachers. As you get older, and you can become more independent as a learner, then yeah, do you need to go to a live class with a teacher? Maybe not. Maybe you can self-learn using a tutor and using the technology. And I think that's great. There are some people who will always prefer to learn in a cohort-based social type environment with an actual expert. And I think, there'll be the role for those people. But I think as lifelong learning as a field might really evolve more in terms of the role of the teacher and the facilitator in that. But there are some things that at least, without getting really far into the future about what AI may or may not be able to do, that for now, when it comes to understanding kind of the moral dimension of our decision making, what purposes do we want to put technology to? Like, how do we make decisions about our own life pathways? What should we study? What problems should we work on? Right? Those are things that, for me, for right now, I want to talk to a human about, and I think most students are going to benefit from that too. Even graduate students, advanced students, and so on. So
mhm.
that kind of human guidance, I think, is going to remain really important in the education system.
Great answer. Thank you.
I'm really curious to see how, let's say, world's most perfect AI tutor is as impactful as someone who asks the exact same questions, but is actually a person in a relationship with. Like how much that like human to human connection matters in the education. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and it's a really interesting question because say the AI was capable, if it was, I guess, say the AI was capable of being at the same level of verbal
Yeah,
communication as a
yeah. There's
human.
like a Turing test
A
kind of
Turing
deal
test,
thing there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Would a person would you have the same result with the learner if it was coming from an AI as if it was
Yeah.
coming
And if they knew,
straight
they
from
had to know, right? They
if
had
they
to know
knew?
like, oh, this
Yeah,
is Joe, my professor who I've had for 10 years, who for not 10
yeah,
years, for 2 years, and he's great and like I respect him and blah blah blah.
right,
Versus like random AI who like I don't care if they scold me for not turning my homework
right,
in.
and it's telling me that it cares, and it's telling it's that it
Yeah, yeah.
cares, but
But like
it's not a
an AI.
person.
Yeah.
Well, this will take us out of education quickly, but people are, working on this problem. So it's actually been AI therapists for a few years now. There's one
Right.
called Wobot, which I've played with a little bit, does cognitive behavioral
Robot.
therapy. And folks are, now generating kind of AI companions and friends who they,
Mhm.
kind of like the movie Her, they're forming relationships with of various kinds. So I think it's pretty interesting. And if you start marrying some of that with the tutoring concepts, Conmigo is pretty bland at the moment. Like it really just shows up as a kind of
Yeah.
generic tutor, doesn't have a ton of personality, but it does seem helpful is my experience. But you can imagine this becoming more of a substantial relationship for students if they use a tool over a longer period of time. And, I don't know. I don't have a lot of strong intuitions about how that's going to play out. I think it may be different for different people. Some people react
Yeah.
to technology and interaction with technology very differently from others.
Mhm. There was I don't remember what it was called, but there was an example, I think it was a sort of a robot dog or seal or something that was developed in Japan that they
Oh
were
yeah.
using as a companion for people, and it was clearly not real, but it actually really helped people feel better. It was I think they were using it in hospitals or rehab or something like that, and it's
What was it
so
called?
clearly not a real animal, and it was still generating the same kind of emotional response to maybe to a lesser degree, but the same kind of emotional response that you'd have to a human companion. And
So cool.
I think there's real potential for this because there's research also. I was thinking about this when we were talking about AI feedback, that this was done years ago, at least 10 years ago, that the some of the research on grades versus feedback and finding that
Mm.
feedback is just categorically better than giving grades. But the really one of the really interesting things in that research was that even just computer generated feedback, and again, way before we had something like ChatGPT that could give sort of real sounding feedback, but just pre-populated feedback, "You're doing great," that kind of stuff, actually was a positive effect on performance and learning. And, uh, you know, we're seeing that people
Blows my
respond well
mind.
to that. What's that?
It blows my mind that like that works. That
It
just like
does.
generic, like you're doing great, keep going, like
Exactly,
actually
and it
works.
wasn't as effective as a human's response that was tailored to the student, tailored to the situation, but it
Uh-huh.
was more effective than nothing, and, I mean, I see it I have an Apple Watch, and it rewards me for getting my Move Ring closed. I'm like, "Yes, got my Move Ring closed." Like, I don't
Who cares? Yeah.
why do I need validation from my watch? But it does work. We love that kind of feedback as human beings, and I think there's real potential for this to work from an AI that feels real.
Well, I think, sometimes we can overestimate how efficacious we are as teachers or how good we are, at consistently providing useful feedback to our students and so on. It's a lot of work and there's a lot of complexity to it. And I personally have no problem saying that like an assistant, whether human or automated, is probably going to be able to add a lot of value to what I'm able to do as an individual.
Absolutely.
So I definitely welcome that. And yeah, we are also in many ways, robots, right? We respond in very predictable ways to
Mhm,
certain kinds of stimuli. And
So
if you know what
crazy.
those are, it's like set it up to take advantage of that, set the system up in the right way.
mhm.
I have one last question for you, kind of a little bit broader, but still about AI. One of my favorite teachers that used to say that writing was thinking. And he said he didn't actually know what he thought until he started to write about it, didn't actually know what he knows. It seems like these tools are doing a lot of the cognitive overhead of helping people write. How are you, like, how do you hope, or like, how are you thinking about how these tools will, change students' interactions with writing? And not just about plagiarism, like everybody's talking about plagiarism, but actually like developing their ability to think through writing with these tools. Like, what's your hope there?
I might have a slightly outlierish view on this myself, because writing actually usually confuses my thinking. It's actually talking that helps me figure out what I think, usually to another person. Or though sometimes, I'll just kind of like go for a walk and think out, inside my head a bit and kind of work things through, but in a more dialogical fashion with myself. So, I think writing is a very important skill that everyone needs to learn, and that AI is not going to make the need for that skill go away. You can't recognize good writing or understand what makes it good or interact with it in any useful way as an editor or what have you, unless you understand the mechanics of it. And so we have to teach students that, and students that, try to get through their education by just like using ChatGPT to write all their essays or whatever are going to be at a huge disadvantage, I think, when they get out into the workforce. However, I think, thinking comes through a lot of different channels, and some of them are non-linguistic. And there's a lot of different aspects to, both critical and creative thinking that we need to teach students, some of which can be captured in writing. But I think a more interdisciplinary approach to what we've often sort of unfairly put on to the writing teachers as their burden to like teach students to do is going to be a lot better. And the fact that AI is becoming multimodal can help with this, right? Because you can use text to prompt it to create a picture or a diagram or a chart or whatever. So that's something that I hope for in all of this. I also think that, I referenced this earlier, but writing, like many other things, is extremely conducive to being processized, right? You can have a writing process that helps you get a final outcome that's much better than if you just sit there with an open doc and like try to start writing the thing, which is obvious things like outlining and going through various iteration cycles and so on. But AI can be really good at helping you with that, I think. Again, sort of like prompting us rather than us prompting it. And that's one of the areas where I'm excited for the technology and where I hope it will help me. And just an interesting side note, I have adopted and tried probably like a dozen different writing helpers, AI writing helpers, and like literally none of them stuck until Grammarly added AI to it, because I already use Grammarly. Grammarly is like in the flow of my work. I use it to check my work. And it was just super easy for me to start using it to suggest rewriting sentences and stuff like that once it appeared there. All of the other ones, there was just like this barrier to using them because they weren't in the flow for me.
So you're not saying because it was better, you're saying because it was in your workflow already.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not better in any way. It's using exactly the same approach everyone else uses.
But having copy paste the email over to chat, whatever. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Sean or Brian, any final questions you want to do, or coming up on time here?
No, I mean, this was great. And James, I just want to say the way that you speak about education is very much the way I think about it. And it's just, I've loved hearing how you phrase some of these things, because it's absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned.
Sean was really happy that you trashed the learning styles research.
That is Sean's love language.
I don't know if you saw, he blushed. He turned his face turned red like that. That was the joy.
Little tear.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I listened to a previous episode or two, and you guys are thinking about, I think, some of the most important stuff. You guys had an episode on like knowledge transfer, which is amazing, because like that's a thing that Minerva has been banging on about for years now. And like, it's very, very difficult to get people who understand both why it's important and also why it's challenging. And actually, it's another area where I think AI can solve some of the difficult unlocks there, right? Just imagine for a moment, we talked about like having this mental model of how a student works. Imagine the task the student is working on, and the main focus of it, but you also know that it's been exposed to these 3 other techniques or whatever. And so the tutor can now suggest, hey, why don't you try this thing you learned in your other course over here? Maybe that will help you with this problem. And so you prompt the student to start transferring their knowledge. And that's what we all need to kind of scaffold this ability to draw on the right tool from our toolkit in the right time, in the right place. It's just prompts. We need practice. And live teachers can give us that. But if we can get it when we're doing our homework or preparing the big assignment or the project or whatever, I mean, forget about education. Like, that's a huge unlock in my job, right? I want that person sitting on my shoulder, whispering into my ear, telling me like, remember that problem you solved 3 weeks ago? That might be relevant here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. There's a bunch of cool stuff. I'm so excited. I'm really hoping we don't all get scared of it and have like I'm convinced there's going to be like a lull before it comes back. Like, we're in like the hype, and then everyone's going to get a little bit like, oh, this isn't as good as I thought it was going to be, because of course it's not. It never is. But also a bit of a fear, a little bit like Luddite stuff, and we're going to go in this weird trough before it kind of becomes adopted. I'm hoping that trough doesn't slow things down too much in education, which sometimes, as you mentioned, education will be the last to use this, sadly. Thanks, James, for joining us and telling us so much about how you're viewing AI, how Minerva's viewing AI. It was really fantastic to have you on the podcast. So I want to thank you, as well as our listeners, for listening to all this. And of course, always keep learning.
Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.
We'll do like 2 or 3 seconds of silence, and then we'll all hop in. Right, Sean?
Sounds good.
Great.
Joe's doing the lead. Oh, this is awesome.
He's leading.
You're ruining the silence. Ruining the silence. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for listening. I hope this was informative and instructive and super fun. And what's that phrase you have to say at the end, Shauna? You always do the outro. I'm going to screw this up.
You're doing so well. Say, and always keep learning.
Always keep learning. All right, I'm going to do that again. Thanks again, James, for spending some time with us. Yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of hear how AI works from the philosophical angle and just from so much usage in practice. So, listeners, thank you so much for listening as well. And never, what is that to say? Never forget, never stop learning.
Going in the outtakes.
Never learn again. Stop
learning.
learning. Stop learning.
Can we please use this? Can this?
There is no way.
I'm just going to keep cussing my way. I'm going to cuss my way through it. It's a pain in the ass for you to always keep learning.
Begging you, Sean.
Always keep learning.
Begging you to leave this in. Begging.
I hate podcasting. Okay.
Begging.
Do this one more time. Always keep learning. Always keep learning.
Gotta wait till Sean stops laughing.
This is the best thing that's ever happened on this show.
Always keep learning.
I'm going to mute because I'm going to keep laughing here.
All right. Thanks, James, for joining us and telling us so much about how you're viewing AI, how Minerva's viewing AI. It was really fantastic to have you on the podcast. So I want to thank you, as well as our listeners, for listening to all this. And of course, always keep learning. Was that it?
Love
I was going to say never stop learning, but then I was like, oh, I don't think it's that one. I think it's positive.
Maybe you need
negative.
to change the tagline.
We need to change it. I just need like a
That
post-it note.
That was amazing.
Post-it note.
That was
I'm not
amazing.
very good at scripted TV.
The 3 word script, you mean?
Yes. I'm about a simple man.
You need to post it on your monitor.
I know. I need to post it.
Oh my god, that is the best
James.
the best outtake we've ever had.
I do my best.
That's an intake. We're not.
here
I think that's the
out.
cold open, Brian. Maybe that's the cold
here
open.
to-
Please.
I'm here to provide entertainment value.